Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child psychology developmental course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in prenatal development, the newborn, and the transition to parenthood. This is kind of our last foundational chapter where I'm trying to put everybody on equal footing alongside introducing cross-cultural research that isn't really found in any other course. So once we complete this chapter, we'll jump into some more specifics about what types of factors impact childhood development. With that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with a broad overview of prenatal development, the prenatal journey begins when a follicle in a woman's ovary matures and releases an ovum or egg during her monthly menstrual cycle in the process called ovulation. The ovum travels down the fallopian tube towards the uterus where fertilization occurs when the egg is penetrated by a sperm. Conception occurs when the genetic material of the sperm and egg unite to form a single-celled zygote. The fetal programming hypothesis: development in utero is linked to lifelong health, biological, and psychological outcomes. So kind of just like broad biological overview of gestation, which we will cover in more detail in the fall and subsequent slides. One kind of thing that I really haven't mentioned yet, I mentioned it briefly in an example, but this idea called the fetal programming hypothesis, this is another school of thought, or at least a hypothesis, or kind of like a line of thought that is very influential within some developmental psychologists. And as stated here, kind of their idea or their argument rests on the fact that, or it concludes, well said, their argument concludes that prenatal development matters because it's linked to a whole host of not just prenatal outcomes, but also lifelong health, biological, and psychological outcomes. And basically by overlooking the prenatal development, supporters kind of this hypothesis argue that you're really overlooking a key period of human development. And thus, what happens prenatally matters because it is potentially impactful across the lifespan. And we will talk about some ways that this is the case, again, in later slides. What happens during the 3 stages of prenatal development? Beginning with the germinal stage. It's about conception to 2 weeks. 40 to 60% of conceptions fail to implant and do not survive. Infertility, defined broadly as difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to term. 12% of married women in the U.S. have difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to term. About 1/3 are attributed to male fertility factors, about 1/3 to women, and about 1/3 to some kind of undetermined / mix of possible fertility factors, but within males and females. And more specifically, or kind of expanding on the conception breakdown of germinal stage, it is the first stage of prenatal development that begins with the sperm, penetrates the egg. The zygote divides many times through mitosis, forming the blastocyst, or blastocyst, well said, not blastoise. I was kind of getting some interference from Pokemon there. This is a hollow ball of about 150 cells that is the size of the head of a pin. So very small. And so, as stated again, hollow ball of cells with a solid group of cells called the inner cell mass at one end and an outer ring of cells called the trophoblast. You really don't know this. You need to know the specifics here. I'm just kind of giving a little more overview, the necessary if you're interested in kind of these microscopic kind of biological developments. Next, the embryonic stage. This stage lasts between about 2 weeks to 2 month period. The embryonic stage is defined as or characterized as the conception is called an embryo, and it's surrounded by a support system that connects it to the mother. And we'll talk about specific mechanisms such as the placenta momentarily. In the amnion, got close enough with that pronunciation. Inner sac that surrounds the developing organism is filled with the amniotic fluid to cushion and protect it. Again, a lot of this is going to be kind of like basic biological definition kind of stuff here, and we'll unpack some implications later on. And continuing on with the embryonic stage, the placenta, tissue fed by blood vessels from the mother and connected to the embryo by the umbilical cord. The embryo receives oxygen and nutrients from the mother through the placenta. The placental barrier, it offers partial protections from dangerous hormones and chemicals. Organogenesis, process where all major organ systems begin. The blastocyst differentiates / specializes into specific tissues and organ systems. The central nervous system, that is CNS / the spinal cord, brain, and the kidneys and lungs. So as stated, the placenta is a way that the embryo receives oxygen and nutrients from the mother. Some developmental researchers actually will examine the placenta after birth and see if it's correlated with any other early childhood development outcomes. Actually, the lab that I worked at UF partnered up with a Gainesville hospital to work on similar projects. The placenta barrier, kind of breaking this down a little more, this offers, as stated, kind of some protection for the embryo from dangerous hormones and chemicals. One interesting kind of component of this is that it helps protect the embryo from receiving too much stress hormones such as cortisol. But what ends up basically happening through a biological process that I'm not going to get into detail here is that eventually too much cortisol kind of overwhelms that barrier. And then, like, you can imagine like a castle being stormed, and then that cortisol basically works its way to the embryo. So it offers some partial protection, but there's kind of like a threshold wherein too much of, in this case, cortisol, it's just too much, and then they cannot, the placental barrier cannot fully protect the embryo from stress hormones, and thus like one process by which stress can impact human development, and this is prenatally. And then organogenesis, this is just kind of like one reason why prenatal development is so important, and it's kind of straightforward here. You're literally developing like all your organs, your central nervous system that will be with you the rest of your life. Thus, certain kind of like interruptions or kind of like trauma, it's not just like psychological, but like a physical trauma or something along those lines, during specific moments of prenatal development, in this case embryonic stage, can result in different organs being, when a child is born, having kind of issues with particular organs that were developing during the time in which they encountered some kind of a traumatic event, whatever, emotional or literally just like physical harm to the pregnant mother for whatever reason. Like my lab in the Democratic Republic of Congo also kind of tracked mothers' physical accidents, like just falling off a bicycle or something along those lines, or like car crashes, just anything that can have any kind of physical trauma, which could theoretically interrupt this organ developmental process, which then can have lifelong negative impacts. Which leads us right into this idea of a critical period. Prenatal disruptions in this process can cause severe and irreversible damage. So again, kind of as stated before, because not just organs, but like literally the foundation, your biological foundation, and frankly your social foundation is being developed prenatally, and this is why like prenatal stress matters, and just prenatal development in general. And this is adjacent to kind of this idea of critical period. And kind of the idea here is for a critical period is that a development of whatever, so I'll just make up something, your kidneys, occurs within a finite period of time within your lifespan, okay? And once that a period of development is gone, there ain't no other periods of development. That's it. You have that one moment, that critical period wherein that structure for whatever that development is happens. And if something negative happens to you during that period, well, you're more at risk of some kind of negative long-term issue, or something like a miscarriage or some kind of complication during pregnancy. So both potentially prenatal risk and kind of postnatal risk. But kind of the idea here is that critical periods exist. You have to get development in during that time. If it doesn't happen, there will be an adaptation, but still that adaptation can be insufficient, maybe more with no kidneys or something along those lines. And then a newborn baby will then struggle to survive. Primitive parts of the brain develop earliest, regulate digestion, respiration and waste, sleep-wake cycles, and motor movements. So there's a developmental trajectory for all these different organs and parts of the brain, wherein the most primitive parts of the brain develop first. And kind of some evolutionary theory here is that those are kind of like, quote unquote, like our old parts of our brain, like evolutionary speaking, and then like what develops later on prenatally and kind of differentiates us as humans, or even differentiates kind of mammals from other species, is kind of these other parts of the brain that are kind of associated with stuff like you would think about like human consciousness, stuff along those lines, like large prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, all these. The specifics don't super matter here, but just kind of the idea here that the most primitive parts of the brain develop first. If you have some kind of traumatic event that disrupts your ability to breathe, respiration development during you're in deep trouble developmentally. and kind of those more recent evolutionary advancements in humanity, Homo sapien, neurological development, that kind of, those things kind of develop last. And you can even see that with stuff, again, it's overstated in general, but the idea of like the prefrontal cortex and all that stuff, that longevity of development, those things that like make you quote unquote like human, those things kind of develop last, broadly speaking. Other principles of prenatal growth include cephalocaudal development. This is defined as development that begins at the head region and progresses down through the body. Proxiomodistal development, growth and development of muscles from the center outward to the extremities. Orthogenetic principle, which is that development starts globally and undifferentiated, moves toward increasing differentiation and hierarchical integration. So kind of just starting there, we kind of have these three broad principles wherein development starts from the head region and then progresses down through the body. It starts from the middle of your body and then outward, so center outward. And then also kind of development begins as kind of like a global undifferentiated development. Basically what that's meaning here is that cells are just dividing and they have specific roles, but it's not like the cells are dividing very, very early on in prenatal development. It's not like cells are dividing and they're like, okay, this one's for the prefrontal cortex, this one's for the amygdala, this is for the cerebellum. It's rather just kind of like dividing a increase in the amount of cells, but they are kind of undifferentiated. They're not specialized yet. And through time, what happens is cells basically migrate around and they become differentiated. That's when you're like, okay, well, this cell is for, again, the prefrontal cortex. This cell is for your knee or whatever, something along those lines. And it becomes a much more hierarchical, organized integration. So that's when you start kind of forming more complex neurological systems. So you're going from like just kind of almost bland NPC cell development to much more specialized and hierarchical and integrated networks of neurological development and kind of just like cell development in general. And then one way you can track prenatal development is through ultrasound techniques, which we've covered in the previous chapter. The fetal stage, it lasts from the 9th week of pregnancy until birth. Characterized by a remarkable increase in the size and weight of the fetus. All the organ systems complete their development and become functional so that the newborn can survive independently of the mother after birth. Hormones produced prenatally shape the physical and brain development. So I already explained this before with the placental barrier, and actually this is one mechanism by which that the fetal programming hypothesis is kind of like based on, among other kind of mechanisms. But in this case here, kind of stress hormones literally impacting kind of the development of organs, that differentiation aspect of when cells become, specified within certain neurological networks. Not just that, but kind of epigenetic programming is happening during this time. And one pathway is through kind of this stress hormones, cortisol, which we'll talk about a little bit more towards the end of the chapter. But during this period of fetal stage, you see just kind of a rapid increase in the rate of development, wherein kind of organs and just kind of the structure of the fetus becomes much more independent as they prepare to be, outside of the womb. Moving on to maternal health and well-being. Once a woman is pregnant, regular visits to physicians is associated with better health outcomes for the child and mothers. About 6% of U.S. women receive no or very late prenatal care. 12% of U.S. Native women, 10% of U.S. Black women receive no or very little prenatal care. The poor are at greater risk of receiving no or later care. Women who do not receive prenatal care are about 3 times more likely to give birth to low birth weight children and 5 times as likely to experience infant mortality. Low birth weight is defined as weighing below 2,500 grams at birth. Low birth weight has been found to be associated with numerous short and long-term developmental risks. The chance of a woman dying during or shortly after childbirth has been increasing in the United States, while it's been decreasing in most of the quote-unquote developed countries in the world. 29 countries had lower maternal mortality rates than the U.S., and 3 times higher than Canada/UK. That is, the U.S. has 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality than Canada or the UK in 2014. Some scholars have argued that 3/5 of maternal mortality is preventable, with improved quality of healthcare during and after pregnancy. So kind of working through this a little bit here, we have about 6% of U.S. women receiving no or very late prenatal care. So this is kind of like the bottom of care. And this is going to be literally millions of people just by kind of raw numbers. With those numbers being higher for U.S. Native women and U.S. Black women, of course, two populations that have been historically disenfranchised from all institutions and definitely medical care. And one reason why this matters is because regular trips to physicians during prenatal health, during a pregnancy is associated with a whole host of positive developmental outcomes. And not visiting prenatal care or visiting physicians for prenatal care is associated, as stated, with numerous risks, or is associated with a higher risk of negative developmental outcomes occurring. So specifically, a classic one here is this low birth weight thing, which is, as stated, associated with a whole host of short and long-term developmental risks. On the right-hand side here, I have, for example, the effects of low birth weight on school performance and behavioral outcomes of elementary school children in Oman. In this study, it was found that low birth weight children were 2 to 6 times more likely to have poorer school performance in all areas than their normal birth weight peers. So kind of just one example of birth weight predicting early childhood education outcomes, I should say. And there are some historical effects of this. And what I mean by that is this kind of like, even going back 10, 20 years, a lot of these children that are born low birth weight now would have just died. They would not have been able to survive. But with kind of like increased technology, we can keep these children alive, which is good. But they're still going to face some developmental challenges, which are not permanent in general research finds. But you do have to kind of be mindful of them and possibly enroll the child in maybe programs to help the child catch up. It's called catch-up growth. So not just like their body size, but also kind of cognitive development. So really just making sure, kind of identifying at-risk students, and kind of research suggests that if you identify these low birth weight children or extremely low birth weight children, which are even smaller, and kind of if there are programs that target these children and help them like catch up, and then they perform basically at similar rates across multiple developmental outcomes as non-low birth weight children, or just children within that range. Now you have to be careful though, because for example, catching them up physically, so trying to rapidly increase the weight of a baby can have negative health outcomes as well. So it's kind of too quick of catch-up growth, wherein you can actually make the child accidentally like unhealthy or obese or diabetic or something along those lines. In the U.S., and finally wrapping up with the U.S. kind of ranking of childbirth, kind of birth outcomes in general, U.S., not great. always listed, frankly, like most health kind of measures, always listed kind of towards the bottom of industrialized countries. So as stated, here's some numbers about having 3 times the maternal mortality rate as Canada, for example. So not like some radically different country. So not that like, oh, this is magic utopian. It's really just kind of like other industrialized countries have far more healthier developmental outcomes for the mother and the child during childbearing process. And as stated, kind of this researchers argue that there are numerous reasons for this. One are healthcare systems / lack of healthcare systems. So a lot of these women who don't receive prenatal care are uninsured, or it's a grind to kind of get coverage, and to kind of like the stresses that come with being kind of a disenfranchised, maybe a poor woman, maybe a teenage mom, is not that kind of situation is it's possible to like go out on your own and then like, oh, I'm going to figure out all this paperwork and spend all this time figuring this out. Yeah, that can happen, but it's also like a pain in the ass, and they're less likely to do it. Besides the fact that, they've been for example, like Native women, for example, have been historically like abused by these medical institutions, and frankly have little access to them. So not only that they don't have healthcare, but then like you can live in areas where there's basically just like no hospitals or no prenatal care like within your city, which is problematic. They just really don't have that healthcare infrastructure. So again, kind of the idea is those macro features, that economic health policy, that economic infrastructure policy of the amount of hospitals or whatever you have, or even the incentives built into certain healthcare systems, impact the development, in this case here, the life and death of a mother and child. Some other predictors of Birthing outcomes include maternal diet. A well-balanced diet during pregnancy is essential for both a mother and her baby. Developing baby is so small relative to the size of the mother that an extra 300 calories a day is all that is needed to support prenatal growth. Prescription of multivitamin or prenatal vitamin is recommended. It is also recommended to not eat soft cheeses such as feta or some fish such as shark due to high levels of mercury or industrial pollutants. Or potential levels, I should say. Newborns typically weigh, and this is in the pounds, ounces metric, 5 pounds, 8 ounces, or between 5 pounds, 8 ounces, and 8 pounds, 13 ounces. Small for gestational age babies are at a higher risk of negative developmental outcomes. In exercise, improves mood, sleep quality, and body pain, can help prepare body for labor. Low impact activities such as yoga/walking recommended for mothers who were previously minimally active in regards to exercise. So small for gestational age is basically you can look at certain weeks of pregnancy, and there are norms that exist that tells you, oh, the fetus should be, whatever, X grams on Y weeks old. And you can basically track this through time to see, okay, this child or this fetus is kind of a little too small for gestational age. And then you can kind of track this and see if it predicts any long-term negative developmental outcomes. And this study found that mild small for gestational age associated with a significantly increased risk of poor school performance, and the risk increases with the severity of small for gestational age. Further, this risk diminishes after adequate catch-up growth. So again, what even just like kind of basic little statistics here, you can kind of see what's going on here, wherein mild SGA is positively associated for an increased risk, again, thinking in terms of risk, of poor school performance. So that's just one impact or one potential developmental risk factor. That is SGA being a risk factor for poor school performance, and the severity of it kind of also kind of referred to as a dosage effect or kind of the severity of it. That is, as SGA or severe cases of SGA are associated with higher risks of poor school performance. And then we have that catch-up growth. Again, catch-up growth is possible. It's not, and that's why also looking at this, the effect size is small because, as we talked about, numerous things predicts developmental outcomes, and some are more crucial than others given within a particular historical moment. So again, small birth weight 50 years ago, kids far more likely to die. And now children are far more likely to live, and as like programs are developed to help children catch up, both cognitively, socially, and well, I should say not just both, but across the board, cognitively, socially, and physically. Child small for their gestational age are more likely to have similar and the same developmental outcomes as a child who is not small for gestational age. And expanding on that maternal diet point brings us to malnutrition. Malnutrition, obviously a severe restriction of maternal diet. This can result in the disruption of the formation of the spinal cord, fewer brain cells, and stillbirth. It's associated with an increased risk of fewer neurons, a smaller brain, and smaller child, associated with short and long-term developmental delays. Is buffered with parenting practices and school resources. So again, as stated before, because prenatal development has many critical periods, or some could argue that the entire prenatal period is a critical period, that disruptions during those critical periods can lead to severe consequences. So in this case here, malnutrition, the fetus and the mother are not getting proper nutrients. Most likely, malnutrition, you're going to be poorer. And that can have neurological consequences. As stated, a smaller brain, fewer neurons, kind of less connections, kind of less white matter, which myelination for those people who took my lifespan developmental course, and just kind of maybe interruptions to your spinal cord. So all things that can have lifelong cognitive and physical effects. In like those other small for gestational age and low birth weight, there is some catch-up growth that occur from malnutrition as well, because, well, malnutrition is kind of associated with low birth weight. But parenting practice, for example, help decrease the likelihood that malnutrition is going to permanently negatively impact a developing child, and something like other school resources, for example. So again, kind of like programs, some kind of after-school programs that maybe challenges a child's developmental delays or helps them, tackles them head on kind of thing, catching them back up, scholastically speaking. But also, if they're malnutrition, maybe they don't have enough home at house or at home, enough food at home. Now you have kind of free lunch for if you're, or a reduced lunch if you're low income or poor or something along those lines. Next, teratogens. This is defined as any disease, drug, or other environmental agent that can harm a developing fetus. We have something called sensitive periods. Organ systems are most at risk during periods of rapid development. Now I'm going to stop there momentarily. So I already talked about critical periods, and now we have sensitive periods. I'm really not going to go into much specifics about the difference between the two, but kind of the idea of critical periods is that you have one chance or a very small number of chances for a developmental outcome to occur, and boom, you have that one chance. If you do well on it, you're good. If you don't do well on it, then it's going to harm you basically for the rest of your life. You can't really, that's your one shot. Versus sensitive periods, this is kind of the idea where your brain is, imagine it as like hot plaster where you can mold it. It is a lot more plastic during that time, but even outside of that sensitive period, you can still positively impact that developmental outcome. So basically all a sensitive period is kind of like an accelerated, very extreme sensitive, aka very influenced by the environment, period of development, wherein whatever development occurs at a rapid and sensitive and very environmentally responsive way. Which similar to critical, but in critical, you have that one moment and that's it, you're done. Sensitive, theoretically, you can do a lot, there's a lot more opportunities for catch-up growth and later development of the same organs or neurological systems. So people debate basically if what's certain times of development, prenatal and postnatal development, is this a critical period or is this a sensitive period? AKA, how much change after that period can occur for the developmental outcome. So it's really kind of like how plastic is that developmental outcome after the period is over, and that's kind of the debate. Moving on to dosage and duration, greater and longer exposure of a teratogen, the more likely serious damage will occur. Genetic makeup, susceptibility to harm influenced by genetic makeup of the child and mother, and the environment. Effects depend on the quality of the prenatal and postnatal environments. 50% of newborns have minor problems. About 3% have severe abnormalities due to teratogens. So talking about that dosage duration effect, and you're going to see this, and we're talking about this throughout this book, this class. Kind of the idea is that the more of something, the dosage and duration, the more of that of a negative developmental predictor, the higher likelihood that developmental predictor will result in a negative developmental outcome. So basically, in English, imagine a drug, you're taking a drug, right? The more of that drug you take, and for the longer you take that drug, the greater the impacts will be, correct? Well, kind of the same thing here. The more drugs, for example, a pregnant mother takes, and so the more they take, the longer they take it, the greater risk there is associated with that action. And the same thing with like stress later on in life. So the more stress you're exposed to, so the total dosage of it and the duration of it. So the severity of it basically, and then how long it lasts. Is it chronic or is it acute? So you see that, so you have it kind of like all the way at hormonal level, this dosage and duration impact. You also have it in like behavioral, or like a stressor level. Again, the more severe a stressor is, the more chronic a stressor is, the worse, the greater odds that stressor will produce a negative developmental outcome. Same thing here with teratogens. And on the right-hand side, you can see kind of a rough schematic of of organogenesis and how different weeks of the prenatal process is associated with different aspects of development. Some weeks of development looking at heart development versus other weeks kind of looking at the central nervous system, or I should say, some weeks of gestation centered around central nervous system development, while other gestational weeks are centered around like heart development, something along those lines. And just depending on when that teratogen occurs, that can impact different developing systems because different systems develop at different times during development. Looking at some specific teratogens, the first, tobacco. Rates of smoking has declined across pregnancy in the United States. However, low income, the young, less educated, indigenous, and white women are most at risk. The effects of smoking during pregnancy vary. It's associated with an increased risk of miscarriage, respiratory problems, low birth weight, and school performance. Postnatally, children are at higher risk of sudden infant death syndrome, known as SIDS. That is when a sleeping baby stops breathing and dies. So we see with this kind of this specific teratogen and kind of drug use, like in general across the U.S. has like massively declined within the previous decades. Vaping little up, and I think it's falling again, depending on when you're watching this. But in general, kind of the rates of quote unquote hard drugs have declined through time. But in this case here, tobacco use associated with this increased risk of miscarriage or other issues like respiratory problems, because the infant will have a difficult time breathing, and maybe it could disrupt the tobacco smoke, kind of disrupting the oxygen provided from the mother to the infant. Or the smoke itself could kind of impact infants' kind of like oxygen production. Next, alcohol. It easily passes through the placental barrier. So kind of example there, the placental barrier giving us some help, but at the same time, not foolproof. Alcohol, in this case, passing through it. Can contribute to neuronal death and impairment of glial cells. Glial cells are important because they support and nourish neurons. It's also associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. Facial abnormalities. They're born typically lighter and they have poor postnatal growth. CNS damage, that's central nervous system damage. This is associated with hyperactivity, increased risk of hyperactivity, seizures, tremors, scoring lower on IQ tests, and it's also positively correlated with rates of unemployment. However, it's difficult to untangle the effects of alcohol consumption during pregnancy with other environmental factors. So kind of the big takeaway here, one, fetal alcohol syndrome is kind of a well-known kind of syndrome that exists within popular culture. Again, kind of rooted in alcohol kind of disrupting the development, the neurological development of a child, and also kind of the physical development of a child through neuronal death, or just kind of like disruptions in kind of that neurological growth process, referred to often as a neurogenesis that occurs during prenatal development. But as I stated before, drug use does not occur in a vacuum. And kind of what that's getting at here is that it's kind of really difficult at times to disentangle what specific teratogen is contributing to the negative developmental outcome. So what specific teratogen is specifically or did specifically cause a child to be born low birth weight? Because, for example, we have an understanding that for mothers who use tobacco during pregnancy, those mothers in general are not mothers who are like, whoo, I'm having the best time of my life. Everything is perfect. I have no stressors. I'm living carefree. And hey, I'll just light up a cigarette. No, these people in general are going to be people who are going through some very traumatic events. They are probably going to be more likely to be disenfranchised, probably in difficult circumstances, and kind of having to navigate those those stressors that occurred before pregnancy, now with a new stressor pregnancy, and with all whatever financial hardship that brings. Maybe that person has a lack of social support, but kind of the idea here is that there is something called a natural covariation, aka a natural correlation that exists in the real world, is what I mean by natural correlation. Is that people that drug use doesn't occur in a vacuum, and trauma does not occur in a vacuum. Those things often come together. Thus, trying to unpack which of those specific things, is it adverse child events, or is it the fact that the mother smoked? Which of those things are implicated in that mother's, hypothetical mother's giving birth to a low birth weight child? And not only that, but the other kind of social relationships in their life. If they have a very, very rocky relationship with their parents, their siblings, or their neighbors, or a rough home environment, or have an abusive spouse or something along those lines, or just a bad relationship with their spouse. Oh, I'm super stressed out now. Maybe I'm more likely to try and cope with that through these teratogens, which I then feel guilty about, and blah blah blah. It's a circle of life kind of thing. So that is kind of what I'm referring to here. And now this is where we will look at some adverse child events. These are 11 questions that assess 8 areas of abuse and household dysfunction before 18 years of age. They include measures of abuse such as physical, verbal, and sexual abuse. Measurements of household dysfunction include living with someone with a mental health problem, living with someone who abused substances, incarceration of a family member, witnessing domestic violence, parental divorce or separation. And I went ahead and copied the results from one study, which found that after controlling for race, ethnicity, age, employment status, smoking status, in pre-pregnancy alcohol use, increasing ACEs were positively associated with higher odds of alcohol use during pregnancy. So here we have a study that have found that the more ACEs you experience, again, that dosage effect, the more of ACEs you experience, the more likely you are to use alcohol use during pregnancy. And pre-pregnancy drinking was also strongly associated with alcohol use during pregnancy. So again, you don't become a magical new person once you're a parent. You are still kind of bringing with you kind of your developmental history. And again, kind of trying to disentangle and really even separate these two things. It's a question of kind of ecological validity. And it's just kind of difficult to do so in research because, as stated, ACEs predict the likelihood of prenatal drinking. Some other teratogens include environmental hazards, such as radiation, higher than normal rate of intellectual disability, greater incidence of leukemia and cancers. So one example is documents suggest a single test in 1974 called Centaur exposed the entire population of Tahiti, about 88,000 people at the time, to radiation fallout. Only 63 Polynesian civilians have been compensated for radiation exposure since the test ended in 1996. Estimated that about 100,000 people may have been contaminated in total, with leukemia, lymphoma, and other cancers rife within this population. That is, kind of rates of leukemia and lymphoma are higher than like the national average and suggest, hey, spoiler, radiation is contributing to cancer. So in this case here, we have testing kind of atomic bombs on specific islands, and this is kind of a historical thing that happened. We just took islands and we're like, okay, let's test the bomb here, and what happens to the population? We don't really care. So in this case here, Tahiti kind of experiencing or going through kind of a nuclear test or atomic bomb test, wherein they get exposed to a lot of radiation, and now you have extreme negative health outcomes, not just for parents, or adults, but also children, and this can impact a child, or I should say, impact in multiple generations of families. You also kind of see this many other islands. This is, you also see this in Puerto Rico at Vieques, for example. There's a whole host of protests to kind of like stop testing weaponry on that area because it was like potentially increasing the rates of cancer and kind of destroying the wildlife. But this has happened at numerous islands across the world, and the situation is that those radiation concerns do not just disappear. As stated, they live like biologically within a person, and it's obviously still within like kind of like the immediate environment, soil, and all that kind of stuff, which is going to be associated with negative developmental outcomes such as cancer. Another is pollutants. One longitudinal study in Japan with an N about 33,000, N means the number of participants. So about 33,000 participants, where the participants were recruited in 2001 and followed the particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide concentrations during the 9 months before birth were obtained at the municipal level and assigned to participants who were born in the corresponding municipality. Responses to survey questions about age-appropriate behaviors at age 2.5 and 5.5 years of age as indicators of behavioral development. So basically what researchers did was collect the rates of kind of pollution in the air at a municipal level, and then see if that was correlated with specific behaviors at 2.5 and 5 years of age. So see if there's correlation between the amount of pollutions that mother was exposed to during pregnancy and kind of their child's developmental outcomes. What they found was that prenatal exposure to traffic-related air pollution was associated with behavioral developmental milestone delays of children in a nationally represented sample in Japan. that is, prenatal exposure to traffic-related air pollution was associated with higher odds of problems with inhibition, impulsivities, and an inability to compose phrase sentences. So just kind of complex, or a little more complex sentence formation from children. So in this case here, we see in this Japan study that pollution associated with higher rates of, or I should say, yes, higher rates of negative impulsivity and lower rates of inhibition. So again, a teratogen impacting the mother who's experiencing that pollution directly, and that biochemically impacting her fetus, which in return can be associated with various long-term developmental issues. Natural experiments, and you can think of this almost as quasi-experimental. We've talked about that in our research methods chapter, wherein kind of two natural groups form within the environment. So you kind of have like a control group, and then you have a new group who's been exposed to whatever, natural disaster or war or something along those lines. So for example, 300 women exposed to Hurricane Katrina. Pregnant women were interviewed during pregnancy about their experiences during the hurricane. High hurricane exposure was defined as having 3 or more of the 8 severe hurricane experiences. These include feeling that one's life was in danger, walking through floodwaters, or having a loved one die. The frequency of low birth weight in preterm birth was higher in women with high hurricane exposure than women without high hurricane exposure. So in this case here, the severity of exposure to the hurricane, in this case Katrina, again, you can imagine this as the dosage of Hurricane Katrina that you're taking, is associated with an increased odds of preterm birth, that is being born before the 37th week of pregnancy, or low birth weight, as stated, below 2,500 grams. So in this case here, exposure to Hurricane Katrina increased with a higher odds of giving birth to low birth weight or preterm birth children, and the more exposure, the greater risk there is. The M23 occupation of Goma, DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, I should say. This is a Rwandan proxy group, occupied a major city of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for 13 days, and mothers pregnant during the occupation, that is, lived in the city that was occupied, gave birth to children who were shorter than mothers who were not pregnant during the occupation. So again, this is kind of my own research. And this is looking at mothers who lived in a military occupation and the impact on their children. And as stated, what I found was that mothers who were pregnant during the occupation, that is, lived in the occupied area of Goma, were at higher odds of giving birth to a shorter child than a mother who was pregnant after the occupation, even within the same city. And finally, another study, Haitian immigrants fleeing political instability between 1981 and 2006. Of interest in Haitian history and the kind of decolonial efforts, I would suggest Googling Aristide. And what this study found was that Haitian mothers were 2.8 times more likely to give birth to low birth weight children as compared to Canadian-born mothers. So kind of mothers who were Haitian immigrants, exposed to some level of political violence, was increased with had 2.8 times the odds to give birth to low birth weight children. So again, we can see kind of quote-unquote individual behaviors such as tobacco use, alcohol use. We even see those. We even see there, though, how that's tied up with other stressors in your environment, such as ACEs. And now here we see kind of those macro traumas, those macro teratogens, if you will, how that impacts prenatal development. In this case here, we have a hurricane, so a natural disaster calling these natural disasters now is kind of weird because humans have impacted natural disasters, but whatever, we'll just call them weather-related disasters. Then we have a military occupation, so like a direct military thing, and then we have kind of refugee situation we're in. Similar, there's political violence, but in this case, refugee Haitians fleeing to Canada. All being at higher risk of either preterm birth or low birth weight or being born short. Okay, birth length, it's called sometimes. It's just height of a newborn baby. Now, one method by which those stressors that I talked about impact a child and kind of this intergenerational transmission of stress and trauma and all those kind of things is through the HPA axis. This stands for the hypothalamus pituitary gland adrenal axis. Biologically adapts you to stress. The hypothalamus, H, receives signal for fear, releases a hormone that binds to neuroreceptors in the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases a hormone which binds to receptor in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex then releases cortisol, a stress hormone. Not exactly correct, but close enough. Prolonged and severe maternal stress creates maternal stress hormones, which crosses the placental barrier and program fetal physiological symptoms. So this is just basically one physiological mechanism by which stress impacts the mother and potentially, pregnant, the child as well. And as stated before, the placental barrier does work to act to prevent some cortisol being crossing the placental barrier, thus offering partial protection from overabundance of stress hormone. But too much of the stress hormone kind of overwhelms the barrier, and boom, now we have potential repercussions. But it's important to keep in mind for all biological hormones and just kind of anything biological, there's not just like the bad hormone or something along those lines. Cortisol is produced and is important for babies because it also promotes physical growth. So you need some level of cortisol, but kind of the idea here is too much of it can be increases the odds of negative developmental outcomes. So because cortisol serves multiple purposes, you can't just say, I need to get rid of the stress hormone, because then you basically would be unable to physically grow. And some cortisol, kind of needed to kind of pass the placental barrier. Anyway, again, it's a much more complicated process than this, but broadly stated, because again, it is associated with physical development within the fetus. And kind of one example from a paper that I wanted to grab in the right-hand corner from the abstract, just looking at the parts that I underlined in red. These researchers state that we find that in utero exposure to elevated levels of stress hormone cortisol negatively affects, aka is negatively correlated with offspring cognition, health, and educational attainment. Our results are consistent with recent experimental results in the neurobiological literature linking exogenous exposure to stress hormones in utero with declines in offspring behavioral, cognitive, and motor development. Moreover, we find that not only are mothers with low levels of human capital characterized by higher and more variable cortisol levels. So they're saying not only are mothers with low human capital, so that can be social, that can also be just class basically, they have higher levels of cortisol, but that the negative impact of elevated cortisol on their offspring is greater. So they're saying that not only do kind of low income or kind of just low human capital mothers have higher levels of cortisol in general, but also the impact of elevations of cortisol impact their offspring at a greater rate. AKA their offsprings are at greater susceptibility, at greater risk of exposure to elevated levels of cortisol. And kind of one of the popular buzzword phrases of this is how stress gets under the skin. So this is one mechanism by which stress, which can be interpersonal, family issues, relative, whatever, moderate size of stress to job stress, to whatever, some kind of community-oriented stress, to, oh, my country is rapidly discriminated against me stress. All these kind of stressors impact you at a biological level. Now, does not mean, oh, I have been exposed to stress, therefore I'm screwed. Along those lines, we've talked about protective factors and all those other things. But again, certain environmental conditions are more likely to produce certain stress factors, which are going to be concentrated within small groups of people, which then has kind of negative impacts. So again, a way that class, race, just disenfranchisement gets under your skin and literally kind of programs, what ends up happening is this programs your or a fetus's stress response system. So maybe in the future that 5-year-old is super reactive to any kind of stress-related events that occur in their life. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they're not stressed about anything. Maybe they're numb to the world, and thus you do need some level of stress in order to pay attention to things. It deals with focus and kind of human interactions. So instead, maybe they're under stress, wherein they're numb, they're operating in the world, not really paying attention, kind of like adrift, head in the clouds, maybe kind of thing, which both are adaptive purposes. Serve adaptive purposes. You can imagine in the numb environment, the fetus is being programmed, hey, my environment is really turbulent. Therefore, it's adaptive for me not to react to these stressors around me. Now that's adaptive, but also there are negative developmental consequences associated with that. Or on the other hand, hey, maybe it's adapted for me to be really reactive because the environment is dangerous. And guess what? It's like rational, like on a biological level, to be reactive because guess what? It's a life and death scenario. Now, through time, that can negatively impact you, but you can see here that adaptation can have some positive effects. Theoretically thinking, oh, your brain on a biological level thinking, oh, I'm going to die if I'm not super stressed out all the time because I'm going to grow up in a hostile environment. But at the same time, wear and tear is problematic. And that specific adaptation may not be appropriate in all settings. So maybe it's appropriate for navigating a dangerous neighborhood, but at the same time, maybe it's not appropriate to be that stress reactive in a school setting. So that adaptation is not broadly stated. Positively, it's not really positive across like all environments. And this is just a piece of the complexity associated with stress and adaptations and how they play out in the real world. A different risk factor for negative birth outcomes is age. Young mothers are at a higher risk of birth complications. This could be partially due to reproductive system may not be physically mature enough to give birth to a child who develops optimally prenatally. But at the same time, this can be environmental in nature as well. Teenage moms have more ACEs. They're less likely to seek prenatal care and more likely to be poor. So you have kind of like a reproductive system that's not physically mature yet, not biologically capable of supporting a child, while at the same time, the mother, or I should say specifically a teenage mother, far less likely to seek prenatal care and more likely to be already disenfranchised, a lower class, poorer. And thus that combination of that history of stressors, alongside how they play out during pregnancy, aka you're less likely to get prenatal care, you're less likely to have health care, as we already talked about, associated with maternal mortality, and at the same time kind of having an immature biological system, both combining to increase the risk of birth complications in young mothers. Mothers' experiences, culture, class, and historical factors all impact birth outcomes. There are also different views of the desirability of having children, as well as birth practices vary worldwide. The Kung's son of Namibia labor by themselves as a show of strength. Women in rural North India with a more hands-on experience. Class is also correlated with infant mortality. Black infants are at twice as high of a risk for neonatal death than white infants. There are also cohort effects. Postpartum depression, 15% of new mothers experience postpartum depressions in the U.S. Previous depression and lack of social support increase the risk of postpartum depression. Prolonged depression is associated with hyperactive offspring behavior and elevated cortisol levels within the offspring. So we have different cross-cultural outcomes, and cross-cultural birthing practices, with some cultures being more likely to see birthing as kind of a show of strength and may deliver independently or maybe with a kind of a family member. Other cultures have a lot more of a hands-on experience and maybe a single kind of a medical professional or something culturally relevant or similar to that, working with a mother to deliver. So basically different interpretation of birthing, different practices and people around and kind of ceremonies associated with, or I should say, across the world. So a lot of variation in birthing practices, as well as differences in the desirability of having children. In the United States, people under 35 really, you're seeing more and more people getting married later and having children later and having less children or not having children at all for a whole host of historical reasons that are really applicable to our era of development. Again, we are all shaped by the era that we lived in versus 50 years ago, that classic like boomer family of like, oh, 2 kids and a white picket house or whatever. That reality is not seen as possible by many people, thus and are kind of changing their desire to have children, or at least changing the desire on when to have children or if to get married or something along those lines. And then also we see a racial component, wherein specifically here looking at black U.S. infants being at twice as high of risk for neonatal death than white infants. This is going to be a whole host of reasons. One, kind of Black Americans being historically disenfranchised from medical institutions, kind of being ignored, and often kind of just being medical institutions just engaging in just open malpractice, experimentation. So historical hesitancy, while at the same time a contemporarily kind of overlooking or dismissing of Black Americans. Health problems, while at the same time as well, maybe kind of that cumulative exposure of stressor, disenfranchisement, kind of biologically wearing down Black Americans at higher rates than other races. And there's good research on this, specifically the weathering effect. It's not tested on, but weathering effect is some good research on kind of the impact of that intersectionality between being a woman and being a Black American, and how that impacts you at like a genetic and biological level. So if you're interested in that, check out weathering effects. And postpartum depression, and as always with all this stuff, I told you to play that fun game. Adverse child events associated with increased likelihood of postpartum depression. So you're kind of that history of trauma kind of bringing with you during this period of delivery for the mother. And I have a study to the right-hand side of that. And one reason why postpartum depression, besides the mother's health obviously being a concern, is also associated with negative developmental outcomes in their offspring, because maybe the parents, the mother is unable to be kind of in tune with the child because she is depressed, and thus is kind of struggling with their kind of own life, and thus the child is kind of it's maybe more likely to be stressed out as well, because they really don't have that buffering effect, wherein the mother's providing kind of a base of emotional comfort, kind of in the absence of that, maybe elevated cortisol levels in the child or hyperactivity in the child. At the same time, that mother may be in kind of an abusive relationship, or just living in a poor area. So just kind of a classic scenario wherein people who are already depressed are at greater risk for being depressed as during a postpartum period, and kind of the world around them historically that's happened to them and kind of their current kind of environment, increasing that risk of depression, which then is going to kind of interrupt those social bonds between mother and child, and thus there can be negative developmental consequences. And not only that, these parents are more likely, these mothers are more likely to have less social support. So maybe there's less extended family that could help out with kind of being there as a base of emotional support for the child and the mother as well, obviously, or have a partner in their life, who can provide support for the child and at the same time the mother. So in those cases, again, those kind of natural correlations that exist in the real world, where it's not just history of depression, it's not just current depression, but all these other lack of resources that combine to contribute to these negative developmental outcomes. The father state also impacts prenatal development. Older maternal age is associated with odds of miscarriage. The odds of miscarriage are higher in older fathers. Elevated risk of congenital heart defects, neural tube deficits, defects, I should say, and kidney problems, and is a risk factor for schizophrenia. Parental stress is hypothesized to intergenerationally pass to offspring through DNA and sperm. The sperm carries epigenetic information. Female non-stressed rats injected with sperm from stressed male rats produce stressed offspring. This is new research. So now we're investigating the impact of the paternal biological state on childhood or intergenerational outcomes. So in this case here, we see that paternal stress also on a biological level impacts the developing fetus. In this case here, sperm, or I should say DNA in the sperm, is impacted by the history of traumatic events within the father's life, which may impact their child, as the same case as kind of a mother's history of adverse child events or just traumatic events in general. And this is interesting, kind of exciting, like new research, kind of mechanisms by which males on a biological level kind of impacts the epigenetics of their developing child. And not just beyond the biological level, but obviously kind of a rocky relationship is going to be associated with higher prenatal stress, because, I mean, you're stressed out, you're fighting with your spouse, and that is going to be a stressful scenario versus kind of like a more fruitful, positive relationship. Thus, that that relationship can then serve as a buffering effect or a protective factor, wherein kind of the stressors associated with pregnancy or maybe other stressors involved in their life, that couple can lean on each other to kind of help decrease the impact of stress on each other and on their child. Infant states, a set of states that help regulate the level of stimulation infants receive. Newborns' senses become functional before birth, but have a limited capacity to process information. 2 sleep states, that is quiet sleep and active sleep. In 4 awake states, drowsy, quiet alert, active alert, and crying, reflect levels of activity and alertness. Typically, they sleep 10 to 18 hours a day. Half of the sleep is rapid eye movement sleep, that is REM sleep, REM sleep. A brain consolidates learning during this type of sleep. So that makes kind of sense. The infant is rapidly developing, consolidating memory at a very, like a rapid speed. It's wild how fast it is. Thus, you kind of need a biological process of this, and that is one of which is sleep, and specifically REM sleep. Crying is a way for infants to signal they need something. The average is about 2 hours a day of crying the first 6 weeks, and this drops to about 1 hour per day by 10 to 12 weeks on average. So kind of the general outline here is that newborns have senses. They exist in the world, but it's just too much information, too many things happening on, too much kind of overstimulation. It's kind of a buzzword now, but kind of a lot of stimuli and kind of a limited capacity to process that information can be very, very stressful. And since they can't deal with that, like they can't think through, all right, 1-week-old baby, this is irrational because blah, 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 blah. No, they're just going to cry. It's overwhelming. And they're just like, hey, I need to cry. I need a signal to my caregivers that I'm super stressed out and I need to be soothed through this kind of parent-child, contact. So it could be a physical touch or whatever, talking to the child, something along those lines. So the child understands that they're physiologically like super stressed out, and they need to, evolutionary speaking, contact their caregiver, which is crying. And that is how they get attention and hopefully get a response and kind of get some soothing that way, so then they can be thrown back in the world and be overstimulated again. Protective factors. Outcomes of early risk depend on the quality of the postnatal environment. In low birth weight children, sensitive parenting and toddlerhood exhibited faster rates of improvement in executive function and were virtually indistinguishable from their normal birth weight peers by age 5. The cumulative risk with internalizing problems was buffered by adolescent religiosity and neighborhood collective efficacy in poor neighborhoods among Black teens. Protective factors include personal resources, government support, and supportive postnatal environments. So kind of the idea here is that, as I said, it's not just you get exposed to this traumatic event in general speaking, and then you have for sure a negative development outcomes. People also bring with them resilience to the table. And this can be defined in multiple different ways. The research right now is kind of really mucky. And exactly what that is we'll talk about it later on in the chapter, or not in this chapter, but future chapters. We'll unpack that a little more, but kind of an idea, conceptually speaking, of protection, resiliency, grit, all these kind of things. The resources that a person has impacts the impact of stress on their lives. It impacts if that event is traumatizing to them. That is, negatively impacts them for some X duration of period, maybe across their lifespan. So, for example, low birth weight children who had parents who engaged in sensitive parenting had faster rates of kind of catch-up improvement in executive function. And by the age of 5, as stated, their executive function, which we'll talk about later on, like things like working memory, inhibition, were no different than children who were born normal birth weight by age 5. And then we have internalizing problems. Kind of the risk of that is buffered. That is, kind of the risk is decreased. The odds of that, traumatizing somebody or resulting in a negative developmental outcome is decreased for this thing called neighborhood collective efficacy. I have actually personally know this researcher, and what she looked at is basically neighborhood resources. How many YMCAs do you have? What kind of places where you can go where in your community that can give you some level of social support? Not just therapy, but a place for like social interaction and connection with other people, because that feels good and is good for you. We are social mammals. So personal factors can include personal resources. So people usually talk about like everything kind of in Western psychology. Oh, it's the person, it's the self, or whatever along those lines. But it's not just that. One, that self, that independent resilience is impacted by your developmental history and thus the world around you, because we are all impacted by our environments. But at the same time, also like direct government support. So we already talked about malnutrition, for example. Malnutrition is associated with a whole host of negative developmental outcomes. One way to kind of prevent that or decrease that risk factor is to have a WIC or food stamps. Again, I received food stamps as a kid, and I will call it food stamps my entire life. So food stamps, aka food subsidies, which reduces that the likelihood of malnutrition to develop or whatever. It gives you some calories, even though it's still a little bit of money. I guess it's better than nothing. And then you also kind of like family resources, so social support from your family. Theoretically, they don't hate you, and they're team your relationship. So now you have that social support from them, which is nice. Again, say, oh, I have some depressive symptoms. I have someone I can lean on. I get someone I can drop my child off with. It takes a village to raise a kid. All that kind of good stuff. Next, I wanted to talk about some cultural differences in parenting practices and then kind of wrap it up with some cohort effects. So sleeping arrangements is kind of a big one. Several surveys have found variability, that is differences, in sleeping arrangements across cultures. Co-sleeping is the practice of children sleeping in parents' beds. This cultural variability in children's sleeping arrangements, most societies, that is 2/3, use co-sleeping practices. In the majority of other cases, infants are in the same room but in a different bed. Out of 100 studies or societies studied in this particular research project, the United States was the only society to create a separate room for the baby. Within the U.S., co-sleeping is common among many subcultures, including Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans. So here we can see there are cultural differences in co-sleeping, with most societies in this study engage in some form of co-sleeping, either in the same bed or in the same room but in a different bed. But even in the U.S., wherein it was the country most likely to have their children sleep in a separate room, there are even variations within the U.S., which obviously we all know this. Various subcultures engage in different kind of sleeping practices, as stated. The practice of sleeping in separate beds has not yet been identified in any subsistence societies worldwide. Subsistence society, kind of broadly stated, or just kind of like, you can imagine a community wherein they collect their resources every single day, like the food they need to survive. These are kind of like daily things that they do. This demonstrates that the practice that is so typical in most of North America is actually very unusual worldwide. Such practices become so entrenched that they become moralized, with people evaluating others' choices as right or wrong. But in general, kind of these moral judgments that we have really reflect the culture's underlying values. Now, there are some risks associated with co-sleeping, such as accidentally rolling or on your child while sleeping. So that is obviously something to keep in mind. But in general, is this right or wrong? This morality thing of co-sleeping or not kind of sleeping are kind of culturally based. And the specific practice of co-sleeping will reflect whatever that culture's moral understanding of that behavior is. In this case, if they feel co-sleeping is immoral, they will not do it. If they feel it is moral, they will engage in some kind of co-sleeping arrangement. And one study that looked at this, for example, in 1995, so an old study, but just kind of this is kind of an easy study to diagram, so I kept it. This study looked at Indians and U.S. Americans. They were asked to plan sleeping arrangements for a hypothetical family. Participants in the two groups focused on sleeping values when deciding who sleeps together. The researchers found that the two groups focused on different values when deciding who sleeps together. Indian participants tended to view each of the three arrangements as the best solution 47% of the time. And on the right-hand side, you can see the different arrangements. Not a single U.S. participant viewed arrangement 1 or 2 as the best solution, and 88% of U.S. Americans considered arrangement 3 to be the best. These differences in preferences among sleeping arrangements are based on underlying values. For example, Indians valued the following in descending order of importance: incest avoidance, opposite sex post-pubescent family members cannot share a room, protection of the vulnerable, young children who are needy and vulnerable should not be left alone at night, female chastity and anxiety, unmarried post-pubescent women must be chaperoned to prevent them from engaging in sexual activities, and respect for hierarchy. Post-pubescent males are given social status by not having to sleep with their parents. In the U.S., they value the following in descending order of importance: incest avoidance, This value is often discussed as a cultural universal. Sacred couple. Married couples should be giving their own space for emotional intimacy and sexual privacy. An autonomy ideal. Gender children who are needy and vulnerable should sleep alone to learn to be self-reliant and take care of themselves. So basically, the study is just demonstrating that even behaviors such as sleeping arrangements reflect certain moral values or certain ways of understanding the world within a given culture. As I stated before, everything we do, all our institutions are wrapped up of basically our understandings of the world. They reflect our moral values, they reflect our economic values, our political values. And one of the many reasons why psychology is kind of why we get into psychology, because it impacts our real worlds, lives, I should say. But as I always say, culture is constantly changing, so it's not like this magical thing that's set in stone. Things change through time, but again, even though they change in time, there are still differences that emerge across cultures. One key source of cultural practices guiding development is infants' interactions with their parents. Any differences found in infant interactions with their mothers, and I should add their parents or extended community members, because many cultures are not just raised, their children are not just raised by one mother, but actually a collection of community members, which I'll talk about in later chapters, is of great importance. Interactions mark the beginning of children's socialization process. Research by Keller in 2007 investigated mother-infant interactions in diverse cultural contexts. They consisted of urban middle-class Germans, urban middle-class Greeks, urban lower-class Costa Ricans, rural Indian Gujarati, and rural Cameroonians. So kind of the idea here is that how infants interact with their parents, how involved they are in their personal space is very, very important, because this begins the socialization process. And the socialization process is the process by which parents teach their children society's morals, their values, the cultural norms, the whatever the narrative is of that politics, of that economics. This economic system is good. This economic system is bad. This political system is good. This is bad. This political leader is bad. Whatever. Your family has a long history of being fishermen, so therefore, whatever, the value of fish and stuff like that. So, but kind of the idea is, again, this is very important. And by this, I mean infants' interaction with their parents, because one reason is because it begins the socialization process wherein these differences, cultural differences, emerge. And I should also say class differences within a given society, or different ethnic differences within the same country. Because there is not just the one Cameroonian culture. As you can see, this is kind of focused specifically at rural Cameroonians, and even within there's kind of some variation, but still useful research. And what this study found was that mothers from some cultures engage in more physical contact with their infants than mothers from other cultures. Mothers from some cultures also spend more time face-to-face or in face-to-face interactions with their children. So some cultures differ in the amount of physical contact. So you'll see rural Cameroonians having just basically 100% of the time having body contact, and you can usually see these a child kind of attached basically to their mother. So at all times, kind of like bodily contact, because they feel that's very important developmental. Well, I should say very important developmentally, and thus they should engage in that parental practice. And then there's different times, percentages of the time spent on face-to-face contact and like formal conversations. These differ across cultures, as you can see in the bar graph on the right-hand side. Becoming a family. There are a number of issues that arise as new parents transition from being a couple to becoming a family: fatigue and exhaustion, feelings of anxiety, depression, and self-doubt about parental competence, how to divide the additional work, and financial stress. Smooth transition to parenthood. Some factors that predict this include realistic expectations for how parenthood will change new parents' lives. Personal goals usually need to change following the transition to parenthood. And the father's involvement in childcare is associated with more positive satisfaction trajectories for both parents. So, parenthood brings a set of new stressors that you just have to navigate through life. That happens. So, kind of stressor of the child, which can contribute to feelings of fatigue, exhaustion, anxiety, not just about the child, but also kind of your capacity as a caregiver. And kind of working through that it can be challenging, especially for parents with kind of low social support or financial support. So some important predictors of smooth transition include having a realistic expectation. So not thinking like, woo, parenthood's going to be the best time of my life. It's going to be so easy. So research suggests that like realistic expectations of parenthood is associated with more positive outcomes, because you know what to expect. It's not like, oh, I thought this is going to be amazing, but this is like kind of challenging. It's like a big shock kind of thing, versus coming into this more prepared and having realistic expectations. And then obviously having social support. So father involvement, critical, not just financially, but also again critically for emotional support, and obviously helping raise the child. Parenting practice is very important to child developmental outcomes. It's been historically overlooked, but as new research has looked at this, we have obviously found the self-evident conclusion that yes, fathers play a very important role in child development, and thus kind of paternal involvement and positive kind of relationships with father between the mother and father is associated with positive development outcomes in the child. Breaking news. New parenthood is a stressful transition. Marital satisfaction typically slightly declines in the first year after a baby is born and then continues to decline. Spillover effects from work stress on family life or vice versa can decrease the amount of overall energy, which then can kind of like harm the marital relationship, can disproportionately harm mother's sense of mastery, self-esteem. However, parents typically still emphasize the positives about parenthood and feel it has contributed a great deal to their personal development. So kind of the idea of spillover effects is that, as stated, you're not just this one person in one context and then you're magically a different person in another context. You can pretend to be so and act in certain ways, yes, but guess what? You're still bringing that with you. So for example, you have a bad day at work, you're more super stressed out, you're more likely to be stressed out in your home life. Or conversely, stress on your home life, more likely to be super stressed out at work. These domains spill over each other and affect each other in kind of dynamic ways. So you can imagine a mother not having a maternal leave, which is very likely because she lives in the United States. And thus you lose that kind of sense of income, and all of a sudden now the father is super stressed out, the mother's super stressed out, and that stress impacts his performance at work. Oh no, he's like fired, and now now he's like super depressed. That screws up their relationship. It harms the child's development, and there you can see that cascading effect resulting from those initial spillover effects of stress. And thus why parents with social support, with financial support, have more kind of resources to kind of navigate these challenges. Mothers and fathers. Researchers repeatedly find that fathers and mothers are similar in caring for infants. They are both able to feed their babies effectively, provide sensitive parenting, become objects of attachment, serve as secure bases. Mothers spend more time directly caring for infants. However, there are a few differences between mothers and fathers in how they interact with their children. Fathers play more, mothers provide more direct care. So again, breaking news. Mothers and fathers both matter developmentally, and it becomes even more self-evident when you look across cultures, wherein it's just not one mother taking care of the child, but like multiple members of community taking care of a child. So basically, I don't know if I can say this completely, but the more strong, positive social relationships involved in that child's life and in their parents' life, or those sets of caregivers' lives, the more likely those developmental outcomes will be positive. And our last kind of big meaty slide here, mother-child and father-child relationships cannot be understood without considering the spouse. There are indirect effects. Mothers who have close, supportive relationships with their husbands tend to interact more patiently and sensitively with their babies. Fathers who have just had pleasant conversation with their wives are more supportive and engaged when they interact with their children. When parents compete rather than cooperate, their infants show, or I should say, may show signs of insecure attachment, or may become securely attached to one parent, but be blocked from enjoying close relationship with both parents. So kind of like is the ecological validity point here, that there's not just the mother, she just exists in a vacuum wherein she's parenting, or even the father, just in this floating like realm where she parents, or where he parents by himself. No, they also have relationships with each other, and their relationship with each other is going to impact how they communicate, how they parent with their child. So mothers who have close supportive relationships with with the fathers, and fathers who have supportive relationships with the mothers are more likely to engage in sensitive parenting with their child, be more interactive and supportive with their children. While parents who are competitive, and you can see this as in both a marriage or a divorced parent, wherein like parents are kind of competing with each other and trying to be the one loved parent, and then trying to block the child from interacting with the other parent. This can contribute to a whole host of negative developmental issues for the child directly, and again, by deteriorating that relationship between mother and father. That deteriorated relationship can indirectly, because that's going to contribute to stress and something that preoccupies your mind, make you a little more short, quick-tempered or less patient, just stuff that happens when you have kind of a rocky relationship with people that are highly involved in your life, and thus that can then negatively impact the development of a child. And these are just some historical trends and parenting roles to lead you off with. Looking at between 1970 and 1960, these trends are more or less have continued through time, where the big trends being that most households are dual income for a whole host of historical economic reasons that I explained in other classes, and through time, fathers spending more time with their child and engaging in more childcare, house care, and mothers spending more time in paid work care. Mothers still, on average, spending more time, but this kind of percentage has been kind of declining through time in the United States for a whole host of different historical reasons. Kind of reflects cohort effects. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.